And welcome to my presentation on the AS NZS ISO 31000-2009. It's a risk management standard, and I'm the presenter, Thomas Faircloth. So let's get stuck in. Hope you enjoy. Okay, so the origin of the standard. Well, the first Australian and New Zealand risk management strategy was released back in 1995 and then updated in 1999 and 2004. This standard, rather rapidly, was adopted by other countries, and in 2005, an international working group was set up with the sole purpose of producing an international standard which would build upon the AS NZ 3260 standard as a foundation. Now, later in 2009, the standard which we're discussing, the AS NZS ISO 31000-2009, was released. So what is the standard? Well, simply, it's an international standard which provides principles and guidelines for effective risk management. It's industry agnostic, which means it can apply to any type of risk in any type of organization, and it's intended to be tailored by the organization to meet the organization's needs. It's a set of definitions, terms, and principles which help guide and inform effective risk management, and it's an outline for creating a risk management framework and its processes. So what are the major elements? Well, they're divided into three parts: the 11 principles for managing risk, the 5 components which make up the framework, and the 5 processes for managing risks. Okay, so here we have the relationship of the major elements. Here you see the principles, the framework, and the process. And the principles are fed into the framework to guide the creation of the framework, while the framework determines the process, and then the process's performance is fed back into the framework, where it will influence, again, the process. And so this is cyclic in nature, and that'll happen again and again during the lifetime of the project. Okay, so principles and performance criteria. These are the principles as mentioned in the standard, and there's 11 of them. And they essentially dictate what makes up effective risk management. So, for example, they're stating that in order for risk management to be effective, it has to create and protect value. It has to be integral to the organizational processes, and it has to be part of decision making, along with a few others. I won't go through them all, but as you see, there's quite a few of them which make up the principles of the standard. Okay, so we have the process of managing risk, and here we have figure 0.1, and this is taken from the ISO standard itself, and in the center sort of spine, you'll see sort of the crux of what makes up the process, and then 2 outer sort of elements which are applied continuously during the process itself. So we have communication and consultation, and this concerns all the internal and external stakeholder communication, which is required to gather their input to the processes and their ownership of the outputs. And on the right-hand side, we have monitoring and review. And this just refers to monitoring of action as the new risks sort of emerge and come forward, and the existing risks change and develop. Now, this change can come from the risks changing themselves or the organization's objectives, so its approach to the project itself. Now, the central spine that makes up the majority of this system is concerned with preparing for and then conducting risk assessment. So you'll see at the top, it starts with establishing the context, feeds down into risk assessment, and then finally into risk treatment. Now, establishing a context, this is simply a matter of defining what the organization wants to achieve. Then, with that in mind, what are the internal and external factors surrounding that? And those internal and external factors, to what degree do they influence the success of the objective? Okay, and then in the grey box is risk assessment. Now, this is actually broken up by the standard into 3 more sections: risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. Risk identification requires the application of a systematic process which understands what could happen, how, when, and why, essentially, while the risk analysis is more concerned with the actual consequences of the risks themselves and the likelihood of those consequences taking place. Then a risk evaluation that involves making a decision about the level of risk and the priority for attention for that risk through the application of the criteria developed when the context was first established. That's back in the first step. Now, risk treatment is actually the process whereby existing controls are improved or new controls are developed or implemented. This involves the evaluation of a number of different options that are then available, including the analysis of costs and assessment of new risks that might be generated by each of those new options. And once that's taken place, we can then prioritize and start implementing the selected treatment through a planned process. Now, it's important to understand that there's obviously a great deal of iteration which happens between the risk evaluation and the risk treatment stages, as each set of risk treatment options is going to need to be tested until a preferred set is found, which yields not only the best benefit, but the least cost. Okay, so the framework itself. The standard describes the actual implementation of the risk management process through what they call the integration of a management framework. And the framework is set up to provide a foundation of policies, organizational arrangements, structures that are going to be required for the design, implementation, sustain, and improvement of the process. The standard not only describes the important elements that are required in such a framework, it also attempts to describe how an organization should go about creating, then implementing, and keeping those elements up to date and, of course, relevant. And in that figure from the guideline itself, again, you can see right at the top, we've got the organizations need to mandate and sort of come up with a commitment to the risk, how they want to approach it. And beneath that, that feeds into design of the framework, then into implementing risk management, then onto monitoring and review, and finally continual improvement. And those bottom four elements are very cyclic in nature. Obviously, the design feeds back into the organization's mandate for commitment, but a lot of this happens in the bottom four there, sort of on rotation. Alright, so onto the strengths and weaknesses of the standard itself. Strength 1, and I think this is probably the highest priority in terms of the strengths, would be its ability to save users' time and effort. What I mean by that is users can essentially leverage the standard's existing terms and guidelines to save themselves both time and effort, rather than having to create their own, which could be quite a lengthy process. They can rely on those that exist in the standard. This is the argument put forward by Bakhtiarji, and he's saying that using the terms, principles, and guidelines in ISO 31000 means you don't have to spend time and effort creating your own. You can spend time on things that really add value, managing the actual risks. And I think that argument pretty much sums it up. Okay, so the next strength would be its ability to facilitate communication. And what I'm meaning by that is the standard provides the terms and concepts used by the wider risk management community. And that's good because it allows us to avoid any misunderstanding or confusion which might come from us entering into that sort of community as a newer person who might not be as familiar with the lingo, so to speak. And that's the argument put forward by Purdy G, who says, an unprecedented 25 countries voted for the standard, with only Italy voting against. And already it has been formally adopted by many states to replace their national standard and is causing other standard-setting bodies to revisit their documents. As you can see, that's a pretty strong statement. It's been adopted by the wider community, and I'm pretty sure that argument sums that up for me. Okay, so strength. Provide high quality. The standard is essentially allowing users to leverage the expertise of those involved in developing the standard. And that ensures that no aspect of risk management is forgotten, and it allows us to use it as a checklist. So here's the argument put forward by Newdick D in 2011, who says, take advantage of the significant expertise in risk management that the ISO has used in coming up with the standard. Now, a weakness. Obviously, no standard is perfect, and there are a few flaws. Now, the first of which is internal controls. Internal controls are actually the processes and policies affected by people to ensure internal processes, which modify the risk, actually work. And what this argument states is the standard really fails to provide an adequate guide for the risk owners to better understand the attributes and the application of those internal controls, which is a bit of a failure. So here's the argument put forward in the article Understanding Internal Controls, which says one of the major weaknesses of the standard is the lack of guidance around internal controls, which I think really underlines this argument. Okay, so weakness, lack of implementation, specification. This is important, and essentially what we're stating here is that despite the extensive discussion which happens within the standard around the concepts of implementation, describing both frameworks and processes, the standard really lacks the practical guidance on implementing that standard as either a new or a replacement to an existing strategy. And this is the argument put forward by Purdy G, who says the most pressing need, however, is to develop some practical guidance on the implementation of the standard. Again, I think that underlines the argument here really nicely. Okay, so the application to games development. As previously stated, the standard is really industry agnostic, so it can be applied to any type of risk in any type of organization in any industry. And as such, we don't really have a specific example of its application to games development. What we have here is a more generic approach, um, which has been provided, called the implementation process. And this can be divided into 12 cyclic steps. And these steps can be jumped in at any point, depending on where the organization is, and then just followed through. And eventually it will cycle around on itself, so you'll get to all the steps anyway. Now, step one would be the setting objectives with scope. And this step essentially means that the organization is setting out the scope of what it's after, its circumstance. So whether that's to improve the framework or to construct a full risk management framework or even just to reduce risks in a very certain area within risk criteria. Now, step two would be establishing an environment. And this is simply the process of establishing and defining the context which surrounds the risk by identifying information such as the internal and external environment surrounding both the organization, the project, and the risk itself. Okay, so step three, identify and analyze the risks. For the purpose of achieving objectives, it's going to be necessary to have an understanding of what all the risks are. And so in this step, we're essentially just coming up with a comprehensive list of the risks themselves. Step four, we're going to want to define risk criteria. And this step simply involves setting risk criteria as described within the standard. So that's all pretty straightforward. Question five, evaluate the risks. Once the risks are identified and risk criteria clarified, the risks can be evaluated against the risk criteria. Now, step six, decision on acceptable risks. Are the risks acceptable? Obviously, this step just involves a decision whether the risks evaluated are acceptable, so a go or no go. Okay, so set framework requirements. This step defines the general requirements for the framework, be that high-level organizational or even just low-level sort of operational control. Now, step 8, design and modify the framework. With requirements of the framework now set, it's obviously possible to go ahead and design and implement the framework to satisfy those requirements. Monitoring and review. Now, in this step, we're essentially talking about the gathering of performance measures and the monitoring and review from the organization of the process and the framework itself. Now, step 10, evaluate the current framework. Having gathered the performance criteria, it's now possible to evaluate the execution of the existing framework. Now, step 11, decision on the validity of the framework. Having evaluated the framework, it's now possible to decide how valid that framework is. Does it need more work? Is it appropriate to the risk, etc.? And if it's not, it can be fed back into the framework requirements setup step. Okay, step 12, performance review against objectives. Now, this step simply involves a performance review against the objectives set by the organization using the performance information again gathered from the monitoring and review step. Okay, so that pretty much sums up the presentation. Here you'll see the references which have been used in the presentation itself. I hope you enjoy. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and post them in the comments section below. Cheers.